The emergency room had already written him off. The monitors were still running, the chest was still rising, but every doctor in that room had already made the decision. Let him go. Nobody said it out loud. They didn't have to. It was in the way they moved too slowly, checked the wrong readings, stood near the door instead of the bed. And then the woman they'd spent 2 years ignoring pushed through them with a defibrillator in her hands and did in 40 seconds what none of them were willing to attempt. He opened his eyes. The room went silent. And 30 minutes later, she was the one being escorted out of the building. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't come around often, and we drop new ones every week. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The city of Harlan Falls, Oregon had the kind of winter that turned everything gray by November and didn't let go until April. Rain came in sideways off the Cascades, flooded the lower districts, and turned the streets outside Callaway Medical Center into something that looked more like a river delta than a hospital parking lot. It was the kind of weather that made tired people feel more tired, and the staff at Callaway's emergency department was always tired. Nora Callihan had worked the overnight shift at Callaway for just under 2 years. She was 34, medium height, kept her dark hair back in a clip that she replaced so often the nurse's station had a drawer full of the same kind. She wore her scrubs plain. No customized patches, no inspirational pins, nothing that asked anyone to notice her. The other nurses had learned early on that Nora wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't need conversation the way some people did. She worked. She stayed late when nobody else would. She covered double shifts without being asked. She memorized patients' charts the way other people memorize song lyrics, which made her useful even when the doctors didn't want to admit it. What the doctors didn't know, what almost nobody at Callaway knew, was that before Nora Callihan became a nurse, she had spent 6 years as a U.S. Army combat medic deployed across 3 separate tours in regions where the gap between alive and dead was sometimes measured in seconds, and the person keeping you on the right side of that gap was whoever happened to be closest with the right training. She had left the military at 28, quietly and without ceremony. No celebration, no extended goodbye. She put in her separation paperwork, shipped her gear home, flew back to Oregon, and enrolled in the nursing program at the state university because she had to do something useful with her hands, and she already knew how human bodies failed. She never talked about it at work. There was no good reason to. She was a nurse. That was enough. Callaway Medical Center was not a prestigious hospital. It was large enough to handle major trauma cases, which meant it got them from the surrounding county by default. Not because anyone chose it, but because it was there. The ER department ran on a rotating roster of residents and 3 attending physicians who shared the overnight hours and shifts that nobody liked and everybody negotiated around. The department was overseen by Dr. Marcus Holt, Chief of Emergency Medicine, who had the posture of a man who expected to be apologized to and the temper of someone who considered that apology overdue. Holt was not incompetent. That would have been easier. He was the kind of doctor who was technically skilled enough to be credible, but who used that credibility as a wall to stand behind instead of a tool to work with. He gave orders the way people drove on icy roads, confidently, without adjusting for conditions. And the people under him had learned that arguing with him cost more than obeying him, so they obeyed him. Nora had understood that arrangement within her first week. She didn't try to fight it. She just worked around it where she could, kept her head down everywhere else, and told herself that the patients were the point and everything else was administrative weather. That arrangement held for 23 months. It ended on a Thursday night in January. The call came in at 11:48 p.m. A male patient, unresponsive, approximate age 40, found on the shoulder of Route 7 after what appeared to be a single-vehicle accident. The paramedics who brought him in were running before the ambulance doors finished opening. Nora heard the radio chatter from the triage desk and was already pulling on a second glove before the stretcher cleared the entrance. The man was in bad shape. His face was swollen on the left side in the specific way that meant orbital fractures rather than soft tissue bruising. There was blood from a laceration above his right ear that had been field dressed with something, gauze, tape, not paramedic standard. Someone had worked on him before the EMTs arrived. His left arm was wrapped tight to his chest like he'd been doing that himself at some point. And the angle of it was wrong enough that Nora registered it as a dislocated shoulder complicated by something else before she even got close enough to read his vitals. Heart rate was 48. Blood pressure 90/60 and still dropping. GCS was 6, which meant he was barely there. Trauma 2, the charge nurse called out, and they moved him. Nora was already at his side going through the secondary assessment when Dr. Holt walked in. He stood at the edge of the bay, looked at the readouts, looked at the patient, and did something Nora had not seen him do in nearly 2 years on the floor. He didn't move toward the bed. He crossed his arms. "What's his ID status?" Holt asked. "No wallet, no phone, no papers," one of the paramedics said. "We ran the plates on what was left of the vehicle, but it came back as a rental." "Rental under what name?" "That's going to take a while to sort out. The vehicle it wasn't in good shape." Holt looked at the patient for a moment longer. Then he turned to the charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had worked the overnight desk for 11 years and had seen enough to know when something was off, but also enough to know when not to say so. "Get me the administrator on call." Gerald picked up the phone without asking why. Nora kept working. She'd threaded a second IV line and was pushing fluids. The patient's blood pressure was stabilizing, barely, but enough to buy time. She put in a fast order for a CT head and chest because the mechanism of injury didn't match the presentation. The impact pattern was wrong for a solo car accident, and the field dressing above his ear was military-grade compression gauze, the kind you didn't pick up at a pharmacy. Holt came back to the bay 8 minutes later. "Hold the imaging." Nora looked up. "His pressure's recovering, but the head presentation needs—" "I said hold it." She kept her voice flat. "He has possible intracranial bleeding. If we delay—" "Callihan." Holt's voice had the specific quality of someone reminding a subordinate of the distance between them. "We have a protocol situation with this patient. Administration is involved. Do not order additional tests until I clear it." Protocol situation was not a medical term. Nora had never heard it used before. She looked at the patient's face, the bruising, the swelling, the controlled breathing of someone whose body was working very hard to stay functional. And she said nothing. She wrote down the time on the chart, 11:59 p.m. Then she stepped back and waited, which was the only option she had. Administrator Phyllis Drummond arrived from somewhere within the hospital at 12:11 a.m. She was a small woman who wore authority like a coat she'd bought in the wrong size. It fit technically, but not naturally. She had worked in hospital administration for 20 years and had the specific skill set of someone who had learned to identify liability before anything else in a room. She and Holt spoke quietly near the nursing station for 4 minutes. Nora was close enough to hear pieces of it. "Not supposed to be in the county. Level of involvement isn't clear yet. We handle this carefully." She wasn't supposed to hear it. She heard it anyway. When Drummond left, Holt came back to the bay and told Nora to maintain monitoring and basic comfort care until further guidance from administration. He used those exact words. Basic comfort care. For a man with a dropping GCS and orbital fractures and a blood pressure that was going to fall off a cliff the moment the fluid pressure stopped holding it up. Nora looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the patient. Neither of them said anything for 15 seconds. Then Gerald quietly moved to the other end of the station. Nora went back to the patient's side. She checked his pupils. Right was sluggish, which meant elevated intracranial pressure was becoming a real problem. She checked the field dressing above his ear and lifted the corner of it carefully, and underneath she found what she'd half expected. The laceration was deep but clean-edged, not the ragged tear you got from a windshield or an asphalt slide. Clean, straight, made by something with an edge. This was not a car accident. She put the dressing back. She checked his arm again. The dislocated shoulder, when she felt along the joint, had a separate bruise pattern underneath the surface swelling that was consistent with a direct impact, something narrow, a baton or a rifle stock. There were small circular bruises on his left forearm, in a cluster that she had seen before, in a completely different context, on a man who'd been restrained by zip ties and fought his way out of them. She stood at the bedside for a moment and thought about what the right thing to do was. She knew what the safest thing to do was. For her job, for her nursing license and her rent, and the careful, quiet life she had built in Harlan Falls so she wouldn't have to think too hard about everything that came before it. She also knew that the man in front of her had approximately 40 minutes before his intracranial pressure reached a point where the damage became irreversible, and that basic comfort care was a phrase that in this specific context meant something closer to deliberate inaction than medicine. She had seen deliberate inaction before. She had seen what it cost. Nora picked up the chart and walked to the workstation and ordered the CT head and cervical spine. Then she ordered a full trauma panel and a portable chest X-ray. She flagged it as urgent. She put her name on it. She did not call Holt first. Gerald saw it happen. He didn't say anything. He pulled the order up on his screen, verified it, and sent it through. Nora went back to the bay and stayed with the patient while they waited for imaging. At 12:31 a.m., the patient opened his eyes. Not fully. Just a partial opening, the kind where you could see that something behind the eyes was trying to surface. His lips moved without producing sound. His right hand, the one on the uninjured side, moved slightly toward his chest, toward the position where a person would wear a badge or a plate carrier, muscle memory from a context she understood without having to be told. "Stay still," Nora said quietly. "You're in a hospital. You're safe for now." His eyes found her face. He blinked once, slowly. "Can you tell me your name?" He said something that might have been a name or might have been a unit designation. It was too low and too broken to be sure. "Okay," she said. "We're going to get imaging and figure out what's happening internally. You took some serious hits. Do you understand me?" He blinked again. "Yes." "Do you know where you are?" A long pause. Then, barely. "Oregon." So he was more oriented than his GCS suggested. She made a note. "Did someone do this to you?" The pause before his answer was different from the pauses before the other answers. Not confusion, consideration. He said, "Don't." One word, clear enough. She understood that too. The CT results came back at 12:48 a.m. There was a small subdural hematoma on the left side, less than a centimeter, not yet causing significant midline shift, but the kind that could evolve rapidly with continued pressure fluctuation. The chest imaging showed 2 cracked ribs on the right, no pneumothorax, which was a significant piece of good luck. His labs were showing early signs of rhabdomyolysis, which meant the muscle damage was extensive and his kidneys were going to need support. This was manageable. All of it was manageable with the right intervention and the right speed. Nora was updating the chart when she heard Holt's voice in the corridor. He was not quiet about it. "Who authorized imaging on the subject in Trauma 2? Gerald's voice, careful. "The attending order is on file, Dr. Holt." "I told the attending to hold imaging. Who placed the order?" Nobody answered that. Holt appeared in the bay entrance 30 seconds later. He looked at the updated chart on the tablet in Nora's hand. He looked at the monitors. He looked at her. "Did you order these tests?" He had signs of intracranial pressure and a deteriorating presentation. The standard of care requires, "I made a clinical decision and you overrode it." "You made an administrative decision," Nora said. "That's different." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. A resident near the door found something to look at on the other side of the hallway. Holt came closer. He kept his voice down, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "Callihan, you have been an adequate floor nurse. You are not a physician. You do not get to decide when standard of care applies and when it doesn't. I told you to hold. You did not hold. Do you understand the position you are putting yourself in?" "His subdural is less than a centimeter right now," she said. "If we don't get neurosurgery involved in the next hour, it won't be. That is not your call." "It's my name on his chart." Holt stared at her for a long moment. Then he took the tablet out of her hands, not roughly, just took it, and walked out of the bay. Nora stayed at the patient's side. She did not touch the monitors. She did not add any further orders. She stood there and watched the numbers and calculated the time. Neurosurgery was paged at 1:15 a.m., not by Nora, but by the on-call resident named Dr. Paige Farrell, who had read the CT results in the system and made the call independently. She was 28, fresh enough to still believe in the chart over the politics, and she walked into Trauma 2 with the focused energy of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of Holt. "Subdural's stable but trending," Farrell said to Nora. "We need to get him upstairs and get neurosurgery eyes on this in person." "There's a hold from administration." Farrell blinked. A what? Administrative hold on the patient. Dr. Holt, is that legal? Nora looked at her steadily. It's what we've been told. Farrell looked at the patient. She looked at the chart. She looked at the numbers on the monitors, which were telling the same story they'd been telling for 90 minutes. This man was spending down whatever reserves he had, and he was spending them fast. I'm going to get Dr. Holt, Farrell said. He won't come. I'm still going to get him. She left. Nora stayed. At 1:22 a.m., the patient's pressure dropped again. Nora made a decision. She did not make it easily. She made it the way she had made similar decisions before, in worse places, with worse equipment and no backup and no possibility of deniability, by looking at what was in front of her and accepting that the only question that mattered was whether she could live with the outcome of not acting. She pulled the crash cart to the bedside. She called a code, which triggered the automated response that brought the floor into motion regardless of what any administrator had said. She began working. What followed was 22 minutes that she would not fully be able to account for afterward, not because she lost track of what she was doing, but because when the work was that immediate and that focused, the part of the brain that narrates experience goes quiet, and only the doing remains. She pushed medications. She managed his airway. When his rhythm went unstable at the 1:31 mark, she had the paddles ready before anyone else in the room understood what was happening, and she used them once, cleanly, and his rhythm came back. Farrell appeared at some point and took the chart without asking and started writing. Gerald appeared and stood at the door of the bay and watched. The patient stabilized at 1:44 a.m. At 1:47 a.m., Dr. Holt walked into the bay with Phyllis Drummond behind him. He looked at the equipment. He looked at the patient. He looked at Nora, who was stripping her gloves and dropping them into the biohazard bin with the deliberate movements of someone who has finished a job and knows it. You called a code, Holt said. He coded. After you... He stopped. Drummond put a hand on his arm, lightly, a gesture that meant not here. He took a breath. You initiated a resuscitation sequence on a patient under administrative hold. I initiated a resuscitation sequence on a patient in cardiac arrest, Nora said. Those are not the same thing. Get her out of this bay. Dr. Holt, Farrell started. Get her out. She finished her shift in the break room, technically. Gerald brought her coffee she didn't ask for and sat down across from her without saying anything, which was a form of solidarity she recognized and appreciated. The hospital was quieter at 3 a.m., in the specific way hospitals are quiet. Not empty, just operating at a lower frequency, the sounds more separated, more distinct. He's stable? She asked. Neurosurgery's up there now, Gerald said. Farrell went with them. Good. Drummond's calling the board. Nora drank her coffee. You knew they were going to do this, Gerald said. It wasn't quite a question. I knew they might. And you did it anyway. She looked at the table. He was going to die. Gerald turned his coffee cup slowly. He was a careful man, and careful men sometimes took a while to find the thing they actually wanted to say. The person they didn't want saved. You know that's going to be the story they tell. I know. And you're okay with that? She thought about it for a moment. Not the answer, she knew the answer, but the shape of it, whether there was anything in it she hadn't fully looked at. There wasn't. No, she said, but I'd do it again. Gerald nodded once. He got up and refilled his coffee and went back to his desk and said nothing more about it, which was the most useful thing he could have done. At 6:45 a.m., with the overnight shift ending and the day staff arriving in that shuffling transition that hospitals manage twice daily, Nora was called to the administrator's office on the 4th floor. The room had a large window overlooking the parking lot, which was filling with morning arrivals, people in coats moving from cars to the entrance with their heads down against the January wind. Drummond was seated. Holt was standing by the window. There was a man Nora didn't recognize sitting to the side of the desk. Middle 50s, gray suit, the kind of person whose job title was never precisely stated, but whose presence in a room always meant something was being decided. Sit down, Miss Callihan, Drummond said. Nora sat. The conversation that followed lasted 19 minutes. She measured it against the clock on the wall. Drummond did most of the talking. The language was careful, institutional, the kind of language that had been specifically designed to make large things sound like small things, and to make decisions that had already been made sound like outcomes that had been reluctantly reached. Insubordination, violation of direct clinical orders, unauthorized escalation of treatment on a designated administrative case, risk to hospital policy and legal standing. The board had been consulted. The decision had been made to suspend her nursing credentials pending a formal review, effective immediately, and to terminate her employment with Callaway Medical Center, also effective immediately. Holt didn't say anything during the 19 minutes. He stood by the window and looked at the parking lot. The man in the gray suit took notes. When Drummond finished, she slid a document across the desk. "This outlines your separation terms," she said. "There's a provision for a limited severance conditional on—" "I'm not signing that," Nora said. Drummond paused. "Ms. Callihan, it would be in your interest to— I saved a man's life last night. Your hospital tried to stop me from doing it, and when I did it anyway, you called it insubordination." She kept her voice even, not because she wasn't angry, but because anger was a tool and this was not the right moment to use it. "I'm not going to sign a document that frames that as misconduct, so if you're terminating me, terminate me. But I'm not signing." Another pause. Drummond looked at the gray suit man. Something passed between them that Nora wasn't supposed to see. "Very well," Drummond said. "Someone from security will escort you to collect your personal belongings from your locker." Nora stood up. She walked out of the office and down the hallway and took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed the 4 flights down to put herself back together before she had to face the ER floor. The security guard was already waiting at the bottom. He was young, maybe 25, and had the decency to look uncomfortable about what he'd been asked to do. He walked beside her, not behind her, which was a small thing, but she noticed it. The ER was between rushes when they came through. The night staff was still doing handoffs, clipboards changing hands, the particular controlled chaos of shift transition. People noticed. Of course they noticed. A nurse being walked out by security was the kind of thing that registered even in a busy department. Faces turned. She saw people she'd worked beside for nearly 2 years. Justine, the charge nurse from the West Wing, who looked at the floor. Ramirez, the senior paramedic who had brought patients to her table and trusted her judgment on every one of them, who looked at his paperwork. The 2 residents from the overnight team who were filling out discharge notes and who found those notes very interesting all of a sudden. Nobody spoke. She opened her locker, took out her bag, her civilian jacket, the extra pen she kept clipped to the inside of the door. She checked that she had her keys. She didn't look around the room again. She walked out through the ambulance bay because it was the fastest way to the parking lot, and she didn't want to go back through the waiting room. The cold hit her when the doors opened. January in Harlan Falls, full morning, gray sky, the kind of cold that found the gaps in whatever you were wearing. She stopped on the ramp for a moment, just to breathe, because the inside of the hospital had been short on oxygen somehow, and out here at least the air was honest. Her car was in the far row. She started walking toward it. She did not look back at the building. She was not going to cry about this. She had made a decision, and she stood behind it, and the hospital could do whatever it needed to do with its policies and its administrative holds, and its carefully worded termination paperwork. She knew what had been in front of her, and she knew what she'd done, and she was going to have to live with the fallout of it, which was fine. She had lived with worse fallout in worse places. She was most of the way to her car when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Farrell, the young resident, still in her scrubs, coat half on, breathing a little fast like she'd jogged to catch up. "He's awake," Farrell said. Nora waited. "He's been asking for the nurse, specifically." Farrell's voice was doing something complicated. "He woke up about 40 minutes ago. His first coherent thing, like the first thing he actually said, was to ask about the nurse with the dark hair who told him he was safe." Nora said nothing. "I thought you should know," Farrell said, "before you left." "Thank you." Farrell stood there a moment longer, like there was something else she wanted to say but hadn't worked out how to say it. Then she turned and went back toward the building. Nora got into her car and sat there for a minute before starting the engine. The man upstairs didn't know her name. He'd asked for the nurse with dark hair. That was all he had to go on, and it turned out to be enough, which was the kind of thing that shouldn't matter and did anyway. She started the car. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, sitting in that parking lot in the January cold with her termination still warm in the air around her, was that by the time she reached her apartment 14 minutes away, a phone call had already been made from the 4th floor of Callaway Medical Center to a number that did not appear in any hospital directory. And that call had been received by a man in a building 40 miles from Harlan Falls, who had spent the last 31 hours trying to determine whether a specific patient had survived a specific event. And that man, when he heard the word survived, had made a second call. And the second call had gone to people who were already in motion. The man upstairs, the one with the military-grade field dressing and the zip-tie bruises and the muscle memory that moved his hand toward where a plate carrier should have been, had a name. It wasn't on any hospital record. It wasn't in the rental car system that Harlan Falls PD was working through. But somewhere in the building she'd just been walked out of, in a room she'd never been inside, the man she'd kept alive was starting to understand exactly where he was and how he'd gotten there. And the fact that he was alive to understand any of it came down entirely to the woman they'd just fired. He was going to remember that. So were the people coming to find him. So were the people coming to find him. They arrived at Callaway Medical Center at 9:14 a.m., 47 minutes after Nora pulled out of the parking lot. 3 vehicles. 2 black SUVs and 1 gray sedan that was less conspicuous than the SUVs, but not by much, because when you parked vehicles that deliberately unremarkable in a hospital lot, the deliberateness was its own kind of signal. The men who climbed out of them were dressed in civilian clothing, dark jackets, plain pants, nothing that announced branch or rank. But they moved with the particular economy of people who had trained the waste out of every gesture, and the security guard at the ambulance bay entrance watched them cross the lot and did not ask himself why he was suddenly very focused on his shoes. There were 6 of them in total. The one who walked ahead of the others was a woman, late 30s, short hair the color of old copper, moving with the forward lean of someone who had already decided where the conversation was going to end up before it started. She had a federal identification in a leather holder that she didn't flash dramatically. She just held it at shoulder height, like a hall pass, like she'd done this enough times that the theater of it had long since worn off. Her name was Agent Dara Sellens, and she had been awake for 36 hours. She went directly to the 4th floor without stopping at reception, which told the day shift charge nurse everything about the kind of authority she carried. Phyllis Drummond met her in the hallway outside the administrator's office, and the conversation that followed was brief enough that the nurse stationed at the nearby desk could hear most of it without trying. "We need access to the patient in the neurology observation unit," Sellens said. "That patient is under—" "I know what he's under. That hold has been superseded as of 40 minutes ago." She handed Drummond a document. "That's a federal authorization. The patient is now under protective custody. Your hospital's administrative authority over his care and his presence here is suspended." Drummond looked at the document. She looked at it the way people look at things they want to dispute but can't find the technical ground to dispute. "His physician will need to be notified. We've already been in contact with your neurosurgery department." Sellens took the document back. "I need your cooperation on one other matter. The nurse who treated him last night before your team intervened." The pause that followed was barely perceptible. "She's been separated from the hospital." "I know that too." Sellens looked at her steadily. "I'm going to need everything you have on that separation. Every document, every communication, every order that was given from the moment that patient arrived until the moment she left the building. Those are internal hospital records, and I have a federal warrant for them." She pulled a second document from the same inside pocket, the motion practiced and efficient. "I'd like to start with Dr. Holt's communications from 11 p.m. last night forward." Drummond's face did not change in any visible way, but something behind it did. Nora was at her kitchen table when her phone rang. She had been sitting there for approximately 2 hours. She had made coffee and not finished it. She had opened her laptop twice and closed it twice without typing anything. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in the East District of Harlan Falls, and from where she sat she could see a sliver of the Willamette tributary that ran behind the block, gray-brown in the January light, moving fast with the recent rain. She had been watching it without really watching it, which was the kind of not quite thinking she sometimes did when there was too much to actually think about. The number on her phone screen was her sister's, which meant it wasn't about the hospital. She considered letting it go to voicemail. She picked up. "I saw the online staff listings update," her sister Carla said without preamble. She lived in Sacramento and worked in real estate and had the particular directness of someone who spent her professional life identifying the core issue and moving toward it. "It says you're no longer with Callaway." That was fast. Hospital admin systems update in real time now, apparently. A pause. What happened? I made a call they didn't want me to make. A clinical call? Yes. Another pause, longer. And the patient? Alive. So you saved someone and they fired you for it. Nora turned her coffee cup slowly. That's the short version. What's the long version? The long version has pieces I don't fully understand yet. She stopped. I'll call you later, Carr. I'm still... She searched for the word. Processing. Okay. Her sister's voice shifted into something quieter. You doing all right? Yeah. You sure? No, Nora said, but I will be. She hung up and looked at her coffee and thought about heating it up, and didn't. The thing she kept coming back to, the thing she hadn't said to Carla and wouldn't have known how to, was the document. The separation terms Drummond had pushed across the desk. There had been language in it, buried in the third paragraph, that she had caught before they stopped talking. A confidentiality clause, specifically worded around patient identity, treatment decisions, and internal administrative communications related to the incident. She had read it twice in the room to make sure she was reading it correctly. They had wanted her to sign away everything she knew about that patient, not just her job, her silence. That was not standard separation language. She had read enough hospital employment documents in her career to know that. And the fact that they'd been prepared to offer severance in exchange for that specific silence meant that whatever was happening with the man in Trauma 2 was something they needed to stay quiet, and they had believed that money might be the thing that made her quiet. It had not occurred to them that she wouldn't take the money. That oversight said something about them. She wasn't sure yet what it said about what came next. The call she was not expecting came at 11:40. Unknown number, Oregon area code. She almost didn't answer. She answered because she had spent the morning not answering the phone calls that were actually nothing. A pharmacy reminder, a neighbor about a package, and because at some point you had to stop being cautious about answering your own phone. Ms. Callihan. The voice was a woman's. Direct, not unfriendly. The particular brisk quality of someone who was working through a list and she was on it. My name is Agent Dara Sellens. I'm calling from Callaway Medical Center. I'd like to speak with you today, in person, at your convenience, though sooner would be better. Nora did not say anything for a moment. Ms. Callihan? What agency? Nora asked. Federal. I can give you the full details when we meet. I don't want to get into the specifics on an unsecured call. A brief pause. I'll tell you this much. We know what happened last night. We know what you were asked to do and what you did instead, and we need your account of it. Why? Because the account matters, Sellens said, in ways I think you're starting to figure out. Nora looked at the sliver of river outside her window. Can you come here? I can come wherever is most comfortable for you. My address is... I have it. There was a slight adjustment in Sellens' voice, not apologetic exactly, but acknowledging. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The call ended. Nora sat with the phone in her hand for a few seconds. Then she got up and heated her coffee and found a second mug in the cabinet and put the kettle on for tea in case Sellens was a tea person, because that was the kind of mundane problem that was easier to solve than the other ones. Sellens arrived in 19 minutes, alone, which was a choice that Nora filed away without commenting on. She was medium height, up close, and had the look of someone who did not sleep as much as she should, and had made a kind of peace with that. She accepted the coffee without ceremony and sat down at the kitchen table and opened a thin folder without any of the preliminary small talk that people sometimes use to make interviews feel less like interviews. The man you treated last night, Sellens said. His name is Wade Corrick. He's a Special Operations Intelligence Officer currently attached to a joint federal task force. He's been running a 13-month investigation into an illegal weapons distribution network operating through medical supply chains in the Pacific Northwest. Nora held her coffee mug and said nothing. He was not in a car accident, Sellens continued. He was intercepted on Route 7 by individuals connected to the network he's been investigating. The vehicle accident was staged to explain his injuries. The intent was for him to arrive at Callaway, which was his closest hospital, and for the injuries to become fatal through delayed treatment. The administrative hold, Nora said. Dr. Marcus Holt has had a financial relationship with one of the shell companies connected to the distribution network for approximately 16 months. Selin said it the way you'd state a temperature or a distance, factual, measured, without additional weight, which somehow made it heavier. Phyllis Drummond was not involved in that relationship, but she was responding to pressure from Holt and from external sources above her authority level that she doesn't yet fully understand. She knew something was wrong. She didn't know how wrong. And the man in his gray suit, Selins looked up from the folder. In Drummond's office, Nora said. When they terminated me, there was a man I didn't recognize, gray suit, taking notes. Description? Mid-50s, about my height, brown eyes. He had a ring on his right hand, gold, looked institutional, the kind you get from organizations, not families. Selins wrote something down. That's useful. Who was he? I don't know yet, but I'd like to. She looked at Nora for a moment. You're observant. Occupational habit. From nursing or from before? The question landed with the precision of something that had been aimed. Nora took a slow sip of her coffee. Both. Selins turned a page in the folder. You served as a combat medic. 6 years, 3 tours, most recently attached to a forward surgical unit operating in a designation I'm not going to say out loud in a civilian kitchen. Your medical record from service is, it's not ordinary. It was a long time ago. You treated an enemy combatant under fire during your second tour, Selin said. The man was wounded in an engagement where the objective was capture. You performed emergency surgery with field equipment in a position that was still taking intermittent fire. He survived. 3 members of your unit filed formal commendations. You declined the associated recognition. I was doing my job. Last night you were also doing your job. Last night it cost me my job. Yes, Selin said. It did. She closed the folder. I want to be clear with you about where I stand. What happened to your employment at Callaway is connected to a federal case. The actions taken against you, the termination, the suspension of your credentials, they were not just retaliatory. They were part of an active effort to suppress a witness and protect individuals who are under criminal investigation. That changes what your options are. Nora put down her mug. What does that mean practically? It means the suspension of your nursing license is going to be challenged by my office. It means the termination is going to be reviewed under a very different light than Callaway intends. Selins paused. It also means that things are going to move fast and some of it is going to be uncomfortable. If the people who arranged for Korik to die in that hospital believe that you've talked to us, which they will assume as soon as they know we've been here, you become part of the situation. I'm already part of the situation. More formally part of it. Nora thought about this. Does Korik know I'm the one who... He asked about you by description within an hour of regaining consciousness, Selin said. He's the one who made sure we had your name. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, just a small repositioning of what had felt like a very solitary morning. What do you need from me? Nora asked. Right now, a full statement. Everything from the moment that patient arrived until the moment you left the building. Every order, every conversation, every face in that room, and what they did or didn't do. And after that? Selins picked up her pen. After that, we figure out how deep this goes. Thus, the statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora told it in sequence, without editorializing, which Selin seemed to appreciate. She described the arrival, the field dressing, the bruise patterns, Holt's entrance, the specific language of the administrative hold, the gray suit man, the meeting upstairs, the document they'd wanted her to sign. She described Gerald and Farrell and the residents who had looked at their paperwork. She described the patient opening his eyes and the word he'd said, Oregon, and the way he'd moved his hand toward his chest. Selins asked focused follow-up questions. She did not perform surprise at any of the answers, which meant either she had already known most of it or she had trained herself not to perform surprise, and Nora suspected it was some of both. When they finished, Selins collected her notes and stood. One more thing, Nora said. Selins paused. The separation document, the confidentiality provision, they were ready for that conversation. It was already drafted when I walked in. That means the decision to terminate me was made before the board was consulted, not after. She looked at Selins. Someone knew last night that the authorization hold wasn't going to hold. Someone knew I wasn't going to stop. And someone had already prepared for the possibility that I would have to be removed and silenced. That's not reactive. That's prepared. Selins was quiet for a moment. I know, she said, which means whoever prepared it was confident enough in the outcome that they had paperwork ready. Yes. That's a different kind of organizational reach than a corrupt doctor and a pressured administrator. It is, Selins said. Yes, it is. She left. Nora sat at the table for a while. The river outside was the same color it had been all morning. She looked at it, and then she looked at the empty mug across the table where Selins had been sitting, and then she got up and washed both mugs because that was something she could do, and it was better to do things. 3 miles away, in a hotel 6 blocks from Callaway Medical Center, 2 men were having a different kind of meeting. The hotel was a mid-range chain, the kind with a business center in the lobby that nobody used, and a breakfast service that ended at 9:30. One of the men was the gray-suited man from Drummond's office. His name was Paul Renner, and in the world he moved through, he had 3 different business titles depending on the context, none of which described what he actually did. He was 53 and had the soft hands of someone who had not done physical work in 20 years, but the watchful posture of someone who never fully stopped calculating exits. The other man was younger, mid-40s, and had arrived by different transport and from a different direction, which was not coincidence. She didn't sign, the younger man said. No. Renner turned his coffee cup. He had a habit, apparently. She was more coherent than expected. Does that change the exposure? It changes the timeline. If she's already talking to federal people, which she will be or already is, then the documents we need are going to be more difficult to access. Holt's records, specifically. Holt can be managed. Holt is a liability at this point, not a resource. Renner said it flatly. He was useful when the patient was still in play. Now the patient is alive, the feds have physical access, and Holt is a thread that connects everything in this facility to our operation. What about the nurse? Renner was quiet for a moment. She's a different problem, he said, because she talked? Because she saw things. He tapped the table once, absently. The dressing, the bruises, the way the patient responded to her. She's going to be able to testify to the mechanism of injury in a way that directly contradicts the accident narrative. That's not just about what she said to the federal agent. That's about what she can say in a formal proceeding. The younger man looked at the window. Outside, it was raining again. There are options. There are not options, Renner said, and his voice was suddenly very different. Not louder, not angrier, but with a flatness that made the younger man stop mid-sentence. She is a former military medic who just became a federal witness. Options in that direction create more problems than they solve. What we need is to contain the narrative, not expand the variables. So what do we do? Renner picked up his coffee. We find out exactly how much Corrick told her before she treated him, and we find out what she saw on that patient that she hasn't told anyone yet. He set the cup down. And then we find out who she talks to. Nora did not know she was being watched. She spent the afternoon doing the things that needed doing. She called the Oregon State Board of Nursing and requested information on the suspension review process, which the person on the other end of the line delivered in the careful language of someone who was trying to be helpful without being specific. And she wrote down the key dates and requirements. She emailed her sister a longer version of what had happened, edited for clarity and without the parts she didn't have permission to share yet. She ate something. She couldn't afterward have said exactly what. Standing at the counter because sitting down for a meal felt like a ceremony that required more energy than she had. At 4 p.m., she got a text from an unknown number. It said, "Thank you. WK." She looked at it for a long time. Then she typed back, "How are you feeling?" The response took 3 minutes. "Like I got hit by something larger than a car," which is accurate. She almost smiled. "They're saying it was a car accident. They say a lot of things." She set the phone down and picked it up again. "Are you safe where you are?" "For now." "Are you?" She looked around her apartment. Her keys were by the door. Her shoes were on. She had not taken them off since Selins left, which she had not consciously registered until this moment. "I think so," she typed. "I'll make sure of it," he replied. Then, after a pause, "I heard you didn't sign their document." "No, good." That was the end of the exchange. She put the phone on the counter and looked at it. Then she went to the window and looked at the parking lot below. There was a dark sedan she didn't recognize parked at the end of the row closest to the building's entrance. It had been there when she got home, and it was still there. and the person inside it was not particularly visible through the window angle, but the silhouette of someone sitting in a parked car in a residential lot in the middle of a weekday afternoon was not nothing. She stepped back from the window. Her phone rang. It was Selin's. "Don't go outside tonight," Selin said, and her voice had a different quality than it had that morning. Faster, more compressed. "We have reason to believe your address has been flagged by individuals connected to the network. We're putting a protective detail on your building. They'll be there within the hour." "There's already a sedan outside." A pause. "What kind?" "Dark. 4-door. Can't see the plates from this angle." "Don't go to the window." "I already stepped back." Another pause, shorter. "That's ours. We move faster than I said we would." The quality of Selin's voice shifted again. Some of the compression released. "You're okay, but I want you to stay inside." "I'm not going anywhere." Nora looked at her shoes. "What changed?" "Holt didn't come home tonight." The sentence landed. "He left Callaway at 2:15, Selin said. "He told staff he had a personal matter. His car is at the hospital. His phone is going to voicemail. He had a meeting this morning that we're now aware of. We weren't when I was at your place." "The gray suit man." "We think so. We're working on it." Nora pressed her back against the wall beside the window. A habit. Automatic. "If Holt ran, that means... It means he knows what we have or what we're getting, which means someone told him." Selin's voice was flat and deliberate. "Which means there's still a communication line we haven't found." The apartment felt different than it had an hour ago. Same furniture, same gray light through the window, same sound of rain starting again on the glass. But the geometry of it had changed in the way rooms change when you understand you're not as alone in a situation as you thought you were. "Selin's." "Yes." "The man who texted me, Korik." "I know about the texts. His phone is monitored." A brief pause. "He insisted on reaching out. We couldn't stop him without making a larger argument than we had time for. He said he'd make sure I was safe." "That is also consistent with what I know about him." There was something almost dry in Selin's voice. Almost. "He's not wrong that he has resources, but right now the safest thing for both of you is staying where you are and letting us work." "Understood. We'll have someone at the building entrance by 6. Keep your door locked. If anything changes on your end, call me directly." She gave the number, different from the one she'd called from that morning, which Nora noted. "Not the main line? This one." The call ended. Nora put the phone in her pocket and went to the kitchen and checked the lock on the back door. It was locked. She checked the window latches. They were fine. She went back to the table and sat down and thought very carefully about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the shape of those two categories meant for what came next. What she knew, a federal officer was dead or missing. The people who had arranged for Wade Korik to die in a hospital were now aware that their arrangement had failed and that the nurse who had failed it was talking to federal investigators. The network that Holt was connected to had reach inside the hospital, reach inside the administrative structure, and if there was a communication line that Selin's hadn't found, reach somewhere inside the investigation itself. What she didn't know, where Holt was, who the gray suit man was, how wide the network was, and how many people inside Callaway had been part of it knowingly versus unknowingly. Whether the people in that hotel room 3 miles away were making a decision about her right now. She thought about Wade Korik upstairs in the neurology unit with federal agents outside his door, and a 13-month investigation sitting in whatever secure location held that kind of material, and she thought about the fact that he had texted her from a monitored phone and said he'd make sure she was safe, which was either the most or least reassuring thing she'd heard today, depending on how you measured it. Then her laptop chimed. An email. The sender address was garbled, a string of numbers and letters that meant it had been routed through something, but the subject line was 3 words. "Look at this." And the attachment was a file. She stared at the screen. She did not open it. She picked up the phone and called Selin's new number and said, "Someone just sent me an email with an attachment. Unknown sender. It came through a routed address." Selin said, "Do not open it." "I haven't. Forward it to me, right now. Then close the laptop." Nora forwarded the email. Then she closed the laptop. She sat there with her hand on the lid for a moment, looking at the closed screen. Whatever was in that file, someone had decided she needed to see it. And whoever that someone was, they knew her email address, they knew she was home, and they had sent it in the 40 minutes since Selins left and before the protective detail arrived, which meant the window they'd used was exactly as small and exactly as deliberate as it looked. Which meant the window they'd used was exactly as small and exactly as deliberate as it looked. Selins called back 4 minutes later. "The file is clean," she said, and the word clean had a specific technical meaning in her mouth that had nothing to do with content. No embedded tracking, no payload. Someone wanted you to open it without triggering a flag. "What's in it?" A pause that was 2 seconds too long. Hospital records, internal communications from Callaway going back 14 months, email chains, internal memos, financial authorization documents. Another pause. "Nora, someone inside that hospital has been building a file on Holt for over a year. This didn't come together tonight. This was assembled." "By who?" "We don't know yet. The routing it's going to take time to trace. Whoever sent this knows what they're doing." Nora looked at the closed laptop. "But you can use it." "We can use it. Yes." Selin's voice was careful, the way voices get when something significant has shifted, and the person holding the information is still accounting for what that shift means. "Get some sleep if you can. I'll be in contact before 8. The call ended. Outside, the rain had settled into the steady, committed Oregon variety that didn't perform. It just arrived and stayed. Nora could hear it on the roof above the 3rd floor, and on the window glass, and somewhere below on the metal awning over the building's entrance, where the protective detail was presumably getting wet and not complaining about it, because that was the job. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, it was shallow and full of the low-grade static of a mind that had not finished processing the day and was trying to anyway. She dreamed about a field dressing, military-grade compression gauze, the way it had felt under her fingers when she lifted the edge of it in Trauma 2, and the clean, straight edge of the wound underneath, and the specific quality of knowing, in the middle of a situation, that you are seeing the truth of something that someone else has worked very hard to disguise. She woke at 5:47 a.m. and lay still for a moment and then got up because lying still was not something she was able to do once she was awake, and had not been since the army. So, by 7:15 she had coffee, a full account of the overnight in her head from the text update Selins had sent at 6:50. Holt still missing, the email file under forensic analysis, 2 additional federal agents added to the protective detail at her building, and a call from a number she did not recognize that she answered on the second ring because she was past the point of being cautious about her own phone. Ms. Callihan. Male voice, mid-range, Pacific Northwest accent, worn flat. The way accents go flat after years of talking to people from everywhere. "My name is Garrett Lund. I'm an attorney. I've been retained to represent your interests in the matter of your termination from Callaway Medical Center and the associated suspension of your nursing credentials." "I didn't hire an attorney." "No," he said. "You didn't. The representation is being arranged through a federal victim advocacy provision connected to the case. You're under no obligation to accept it, but I'd recommend you hear me out before deciding." She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Who retained you exactly?" "I'm not able to specify the individual at this point, but the authorization came through legitimate federal channels, and I can provide you with documentation confirming that within the hour." A brief pause. "What I can tell you is that the case against Callaway is moving significantly faster than federal cases of this type typically move, which suggests the evidentiary position is strong and someone with authority wants it resolved quickly." "Someone with authority," she repeated. "That's all I can say right now." He had the professional calm of a person who was used to delivering complicated information to people who were having difficult weeks, and who had learned to make the information as manageable as possible without softening it into uselessness. "What I need from you this morning is authorization to file for emergency reinstatement of your nursing license. The suspension was issued under procedurally irregular circumstances. There's a strong case that it shouldn't have been issued at all, and the review board has been made aware of the federal context." "How soon?" "If we file today, I expect a ruling within 72 hours, possibly less given the circumstances." Nora looked at the window. Gray morning, rain still going. The dark sedan was still there, plus a second vehicle she hadn't seen last night, parked at the other end of the row. "File it," she said. "I'll need a signed authorization form. Send it. I'll sign it today." "Good." A rustling of something. One more thing, you may be contacted by media in the coming days. The nature of the case makes that likely once certain developments become public. My strong recommendation is that you don't speak to anyone, any reporter, any news outlet, without running it through me first. Understood. Is there anything you need from me this morning beyond what we've covered? She thought about it. Not yet. The call ended and she sat with her coffee and the specific feeling of a situation that has expanded overnight into something substantially larger than what it was when you went to sleep, and the recognition that the expansion is not finished. At 9 a.m., Selins arrived again. She was not alone this time. She brought a man with her, late 40s, solid build, brown hair going gray at the sides, wearing a jacket over a flannel shirt that made him look like he'd dressed in a hurry and hadn't looked in a mirror afterward. He had a slight hitch in his left stride, barely visible, the kind that came from an old injury that had healed at an angle. "This is Special Agent Ross Tamblyn," Selins said. "He's the lead investigator on the Coric case." Tamblyn extended his hand. His grip was firm, but not demonstrative. "I've read your statement. I want to go over a few specifics in person." They sat at the same kitchen table. Selins took the same chair as yesterday. Tamblyn sat across from Nora and put a thin tablet on the table between them. "The bruise pattern you described on the patient's left forearm," Tamblyn said. "The cluster consistent with zip tie restraint marks. Can you give me more detail on the distribution?" 6 points of impact, roughly 2 centimeters in diameter each, distributed in a ring pattern approximately 8 centimeters above the wrist joint. The bruising was subcutaneous and approximately 12 to 18 hours old at presentation, which put the restraint incident before the Route 7 event. Tamblyn made a note. "Could you rule out medical restraint, hospital soft cuffs, IV securing devices?" The depth and the geometry were wrong for soft restraint, and the coloration pattern indicated something rigid, probably high tensile zip tie or flex cuff, applied under tension with movement. The bruises weren't uniform compression, they were motion abrasion marks. Tamblyn looked at Selins briefly, then back at Nora. "That puts a prior detention event before the accident." "Yes, you recognize that in the assessment." "I recognize the pattern. From your service." It wasn't a question, but she answered it like one. "From my service. Yes." Tamblyn leaned back slightly. "The field dressing above the ear, you said military-grade compression gauze." "Hemostatic compression gauze, the kind issued to combat units. You can get it through civilian channels now, but it's not standard ER supply, and it's not something a layperson typically has, applies correctly, or uses for a scalp laceration from a car accident. Someone dressed that wound before the paramedics arrived. Someone who knew what they were doing. Coric himself? The angle was wrong for self-application. Someone else did it." Tamblyn made another note. "He had the quality of a person who listened more than he talked, which Nora found easier to work with than its opposite." "One more thing," he said. "When you described the patient's hand movement toward his chest, toward where a plate carrier would be, you said it was muscle memory." "Yes." "Not distress? Not an attempt to communicate?" "It was automatic, subconscious. The way someone reaches for a seatbelt before they're fully awake. He wasn't trying to do it, it happened." She paused. "He was under enough that he wasn't fully directing his movements. That particular gesture came from somewhere very deeply habituated." Tamblyn was quiet for a moment. "How long were you a combat medic before you left?" 6 years. "And you carried?" "I carried." "Same gesture?" She looked at him. "Yes." He nodded once, not sympathetically, just acknowledging the specific territory they were in, which was the territory of people who had done particular things for long enough that those things left marks that didn't go away when the context changed. "Thank you," he said. "That's what I needed." He picked up his tablet. Selins stood. They were clearly about to leave, and then Tamblyn stopped at the edge of the kitchen. "The email file," he said. "The internal Callaway documents. What about the vacations? Someone inside that hospital was documenting Holt's activity and building a parallel record outside the official system." He looked at her steadily. "You worked there for 2 years. You ever see anything that suggested someone was watching him?" Nora thought about it, not performing the thought, actually doing it, running through 23 months of overnight shifts and break room conversations, and the particular social architecture of an ER department where everyone noticed everything and nobody said most of it out loud. There was Gerald, who had pulled the imaging order through without being asked and had come to the break room with coffee and had sat with her without talking, which was the kind of solidarity that came from someone who knew enough to think it was deserved. "Gerald Marsh," she said, "the overnight charge nurse. He's been at Callaway 11 years. Tamblyn wrote it down. "I'm not saying it was him," she added, "but he saw things. And he's careful about what he does with what he sees. We'll talk to him." They left. Nora stood in the kitchen for a moment, then went to the window, then remembered that she shouldn't go to the window, and went to the couch instead and sat down and thought about Gerald, who had refilled his coffee and gone back to his desk without saying another word, and who had been at that desk for 11 years watching Marcus Holt do whatever Marcus Holt did, and who had maybe, at some point, decided that watching was not sufficient. The call from Tamblyn came at 2:33 p.m. "We talked to Gerald Marsh," he said. "He's cooperating fully." A brief pause. "He's been maintaining a secondary record of Holt's irregular decisions for 9 months. Paper records kept off-site. He didn't send you the email. He didn't have the technical capacity to route it the way that file was routed, but he confirmed the content. The financial authorizations, the patient-level interference, the communications with external parties." Another pause. "He said he was waiting for a moment when someone else had seen enough to make it matter." Nora closed her eyes briefly. "He was waiting for corroboration." "Yes, he needed a witness to a specific event, not just paperwork." She understood that. You could have records and they could be dismissed as motivated, as misread, as the product of a disgruntled employee with an agenda. But if someone else, someone without a 9-month investment in the outcome, saw the same thing in real time, the records became a pattern instead of a grievance. She had been, without knowing it, the thing Gerald was waiting for. "Is he safe?" she asked. "He's with us." "Yes." The call ended. She sat with that for a while. Then her phone vibrated with a text from the number she now recognized as Wade Corrick's monitored line. "They tell me you're staying put." "Yes, smart. It's going to move fast today." She looked at the message. "How do you know?" A pause. Then, "Because I told them what I know. All of it. And it was enough." She started to type a response and stopped. Started again. "Are you supposed to be texting me right now?" "Probably not." Tamblyn keeps looking at my phone. Despite everything, she felt the corner of her mouth move. Then stop. "In a minute. I wanted to say something." She waited. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I was doing or why it mattered. You just saw someone who needed help, and you didn't let the room talk you out of it." A pause, longer than the others. "That's rarer than it should be." She read it twice. "Go to sleep," she typed. "You have a subdural." "Had. It's resolving. It's resolving because someone did their job." She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought that she was extraordinarily tired and that tiredness was, under the circumstances, a reasonable response to the last 36 hours of her life. The situation broke open at 4:47 p.m. Sellens called, and Nora heard it in the first syllable, the compression in Sellens' voice that meant something had moved from potential to actual. "Holt surfaced," Sellens said. "He's at a private airfield 40 miles east of Harlan Falls. We have people there. He hasn't boarded anything yet, but there's a charter on the ground that was filed under a holding company name we've been tracking." "You're going to get him." "We're already there. That's not why I'm calling." A breath. "The holding company that filed the charter. We ran it forward. It connects to 3 other entities. One of them is a medical equipment distribution company with contracts in 7 Pacific Northwest hospitals." Nora waited. "Callaway is one of them," Sellens said. "But it's not the primary account. The primary account is Harlan Falls Regional, the larger hospital, the one across town." "I know it. There's a shipment scheduled to arrive at Harlan Falls Regional tonight. Medical supply delivery, standard routing. Except the manifest doesn't match what's actually in the containers, according to information Corrick gave us this morning. And the person who authorized the receiving end of that delivery is a physician at Harlan Falls Regional who has been on Corrick's radar for 6 months. What's in the containers? We're still verifying the specifics, but Corrick's investigation documents suggest components, hardware components, that have been moving through the medical supply chain to avoid standard customs and transport screening. Weapons components. We believe so. Yes. Nora stood up from the couch. She was still wearing shoes, she realized. She hadn't taken them off all day. What does that mean for tonight? It means we have two simultaneous situations, Holt at the airfield and the delivery at regional. We're splitting resources. A pause. It also means that Paul Renner, the man from Drummond's office, is almost certainly connected to the regional delivery. We haven't located him yet. He was at the hotel this morning, Nora said, 3 miles from Callaway. We checked the hotel. He checked out at noon. The apartment was very quiet. Sellens? Yes. If the delivery is tonight and Renner is in the wind, who authorizes the receiving physician? Who is the contact on the ground at regional who tells them to process a shipment with a false manifest? A pause. That's what we're trying to determine, Sellens said. Because if that person is inside the hospital, if there's someone at Harlan Falls Regional tonight who opens those containers and accepts that delivery, you lose the physical evidence. I know that. And if Renner gets to them first, I know, Nora. Sellens' voice was flat and fast. That's why I'm telling you, we're moving on the airfield in the next 20 minutes. I need you to stay where you are and stay reachable. Understood. The call ended. Nora walked to the window, and this time she didn't stop herself, because the sedan was still there and the second vehicle was still there, and the protective detail was doing its job. And she stood at the glass and looked at the gray afternoon and thought about Harlan Falls Regional across town, which she had driven past 100 times in 2 years and had never worked in, and which was apparently the center of something that had been moving through the medical supply chain of the Pacific Northwest for over a year. She thought about what it meant that the man who had arranged for Wade Corrick to die had also arranged the routing of those containers through hospitals. Through hospitals. Through the specific institutional trust that people placed in a hospital, the assumption that what came into the building served the people inside it. She thought about the patients at Harlan Falls Regional tonight, who were not part of any of this and did not know any of this, and who were simply there because they needed to be there. She stepped back from the window. Her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text, but not from any number she recognized. A new number, local area code, and the message was 4 words. They're already inside. Regional. She stared at it. She called Sellens. Voicemail. She called Tamblyn. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried Sellens again. Voicemail again. She stood in the middle of her apartment with the phone in her hand and thought about the specific arithmetic of what she knew and what the text meant, and what the gap between when she'd heard from Sellens and now actually represented in operational time. The airfield was 40 miles east. If they'd moved on it 20 minutes ago, they were in the middle of it right now, which meant Sellens and Tamblyn were not at a desk. They were in the field, which meant reaching them was not a matter of trying harder. The text sat on her screen. They're already inside. Regional. Not the delivery is happening. Not someone is there. Already inside. Present tense. Someone who knew where Nora was and what she was connected to and what she would do with that specific sentence. She pulled up Garrett Lund's number, the attorney, and he answered on the first ring. I need you to contact Sellens' office directly, she said. Not her cell. Her office. Tell them someone just texted my personal phone that individuals connected to the network are already inside Harlan Falls Regional. Tell them I can't reach Sellens or Tamblyn. I'll do it right now. Are you? I'm fine. Do it fast. She hung up. The protective detail was outside. 2 agents at minimum, probably 3 by now. The building's entrance was covered. She was by any reasonable measure exactly where she was supposed to be. She looked at her shoes. She thought about Harlan Falls Regional and the receiving dock where a shipment with a false manifest was scheduled to arrive, and the physician on the inside who had been authorized to accept it, and the person who might reach that physician before the federal agents did. She thought about the patients. She was not going to do something reckless. She was not going to leave a protective detail and walk into a situation she didn't have the full picture of. She was a nurse and a former medic, and she was a federal witness in an active investigation. And all of those things argued very clearly for staying in this apartment and letting the people whose job it was do their job. She sat down. She stood up again. Her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the text. She answered. The voice was not Sellens, not Tamblyn, not Lund. It was a voice she had heard only once before, low and slightly rough, and carrying the specific weight of someone who was spending his words carefully because he had just spent a great many of them and was running low. Nora, Wade Corrick said, listen to me. They pulled Sellen's detail away from Regional to cover the airfield operation. There is one agent on the ground at Harlan Falls Regional right now, and she's trying to cover 2 entry points simultaneously. How are you calling me? I took Tamblin's secondary phone. I have about 4 minutes before someone notices. His voice was tight, the tightness of someone managing pain while trying to sound like they aren't. The physician they need to reach at Regional is Dr. Sona Maris. She's in the hospital right now. She came in for an evening consult. She doesn't know she's the target. Whoever is already inside is going to approach her directly and either get her to authorize the shipment or remove her from the situation. Remove her, Nora said. Yes. Korik, I need Sellen's. I know, Lund is working on it. But Regional is 8 minutes from you and the delivery window is in 35. Nora. His voice dropped slightly. There is one federal agent trying to cover a hospital with 12 entry points. If Maris gets to that receiving dock and processes that shipment before anyone stops her, the physical evidence walks out in a legitimate delivery vehicle and we lose the chain. And if whoever is inside reaches her first, she could get hurt. Yes. The apartment was very quiet. You're not telling me to go, she said. I'm telling you the situation, he said. What you do with it is yours. She looked at the door. She thought about the agent outside who was there to protect her. She thought about Sellen's and Tamblin 40 miles east in the middle of an airfield operation. She thought about a physician named Sona Maris who was somewhere inside Harlan Falls Regional, right now not knowing that the evening was about to become something she had not planned for. If I go, she said, I need to be able to reach the agent on the ground at Regional. A pause. Then, her name is Agent Tessa Vorn. I'm sending you her number right now. The text arrived. Korik. Yeah. Go back to your room. A pause that might have contained something like a short, painful laugh. Be careful. She ended the call. She picked up her jacket. She looked at the door for a long moment, at the lock, at the handle, at the gap at the bottom where she could see the hallway light. Then she opened it and walked out, because the patients at Harlan Falls Regional had not chosen to be inside a building that was about to become part of a federal evidence problem. And there was a doctor in there who didn't know she was in danger, and there was one agent trying to cover 12 entry points. And Nora Callihan had spent 6 years learning that the moment you decided someone else would handle it was the moment things stopped being handleable. She told the agent at the entrance door what she knew in 45 seconds. The agent, young, sharp, already reaching for her radio, did not tell Nora to stop. She said, I'll get someone to you. Go. Nora went. The drive to Harlan Falls Regional was 8 minutes in light traffic. She made it in 6. She parked in the visitor lot and pulled up Vorn's number and called it while she was still in the car. Vorn, the agent answered. Her voice was controlled but had the specific texture of someone who was already managing more than she had personnel for. I'm Nora Callihan. Korik sent me your number. I'm in the regional parking lot. A very brief silence. Of course you are, Vorn said, and the thing in her voice was not quite exasperation and not quite relief, and was somehow both. The receiving dock is on the east side of the building. I'm at the north entrance. I've been trying to locate Maris for the last 12 minutes. She came in through the main entrance at 5:40, and her pager went offline at 6:03. Pager offline. That was not a technical glitch. Someone got to her already, Nora said. Possibly. Or she turned it off herself if she was approached and pressured. A pause. I can't leave the north entrance. If I move, the west loading corridor is unmonitored. I can move. You're a civilian. I'm a former combat medic and a current federal witness, and there's a physician somewhere in that building who may need medical attention. Tell me where to look. A longer pause. Neurology consultation suite, Vorn said. 3rd floor, east corridor. Maris does consults there on Thursday evenings. If someone knew her schedule, they knew her schedule. 3rd floor. Room 314 through 388. If she's been approached, it's one of those rooms. A breath. Nora, do not engage with anyone. If you find her, you call me and you stay on the line. That's it. Understood. She got out of the car. The hospital's main entrance was bright and busy with early evening traffic. Visitors, outpatient appointments, a family with a child in a stroller moving toward the elevator bank. Nobody looked at her. She was a woman in a jacket walking through a hospital lobby, and hospitals absorbed people like that without friction. She took the stairs because the elevator was slower and because she needed the 2 flights to settle her breathing and her hands. Third floor, east corridor. The hallway was quieter than the lobby. Overhead lighting, the low ambient sound of a functioning hospital floor, a nurse's station halfway down, staffed by 2 people who were looking at screens and didn't look up when she passed. She moved down the corridor toward the consultation suite. Room 314, door open, lights on, empty. 315, closed door, no light under the gap. 316, door ajar, light on. She slowed. Through the gap, she could see the edge of a desk, a chair, the corner of someone's white coat. She pushed the door open quietly. The woman in the white coat was sitting at the desk with her back to the door and her shoulders held in the rigid way that meant she was not relaxed, not working, not doing anything voluntary. Her pager was on the desk in front of her, and the screen was dark and her hands were flat on the surface on either side of it. There was a man standing to the left of the desk, between the physician and the window. He was not large. He was not visibly armed, or not in a way that was showing. He had his back partially to the door because his attention was on the woman at the desk. He was wearing a gray suit. Paul Renner turned around. He looked at Nora standing in the doorway, and for 1 second, just one, something moved across his face that was not composure. Then his hand moved toward his jacket, and Nora had exactly the next 3 seconds to decide what she was going to do with the fact that she was a nurse and a former soldier standing in a hospital consultation room doorway with a federal agent 12 minutes away and a physician who needed to not be here anymore. And the man between her and the window had just decided that the document approach was finished. And Nora had exactly the next 3 seconds to decide what she was going to do with the fact that she was a nurse and a former soldier standing in a hospital consultation room doorway with a federal agent 12 minutes away and a physician who needed to not be here anymore. And the man between her and the window had just decided that the document approach was finished. She did not wait for him to finish reaching. She stepped left through the door, hard and fast, putting the doorframe behind her and the desk between herself and Renner, and she said one word at a volume that was not a scream, but was designed to carry, "Vorn." Her phone was already in her hand and the line was already open because she had not ended the call before she came through the door, and Vorn heard it, and Nora heard Vorn's voice change register on the other end and start moving. Renner's hand came out of his jacket without a weapon. What he had was a phone, which he held up in a way that was meant to look like he was making a call, but was actually a way of buying 3 seconds to assess whether the situation had changed in a way he couldn't manage. It had. "Dr. Maris." Nora kept her eyes on Renner and spoke to the woman at the desk. "Stand up. Move to the door behind me." The physician's chair scraped back. She was 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, her face carrying the particular shock of someone who had been in a contained, pressured situation for an indeterminate period and was only now being offered a direction to move. "Now," Nora said, not unkindly, but without room for hesitation in it. Maris stood and moved. Renner took 1 step toward the desk, not toward Nora, toward the position he'd need to be in to intercept the physician, and Nora moved to cut the angle, putting herself between them, which meant she was now approximately 4 feet from a man she did not know the full capability of, and who had demonstrated tonight that he was willing to be in a room alone with a physician in a way that was not voluntary. "The delivery's been flagged," she said to him, keeping her voice level. "The airfield is already active. Holt is in custody." She did not know with certainty that Holt was in custody, but the airfield operation had been moving for over 40 minutes, and she made a calculation about what that meant. Something in Renner's face confirmed it, a small tightening around the eyes that was not anger exactly, but was the expression of a person receiving information they had been hoping to avoid receiving and recognizing they can no longer avoid it. "Step back from the desk," she said. He looked at her for a moment, at her specifically, measuring, the way people look when they're deciding something about you rather than about the situation. "You're the nurse," he said. "Step back." He stepped back, not because she had a weapon, not because she had authority, because the phone line was open and he could hear footsteps on it now, distant but getting less distant, and because the calculation had shifted in the last 90 seconds in a direction he couldn't reverse. Maris was in the hallway. Nora could hear her breathing behind her, fast and shallow, the breathing of someone in a controlled stress response who was doing a reasonable job of managing it. "Go to the nurse's station," Nora said without turning around. Tell them to call security. Don't leave the floor. Maris went. Nora stayed in the doorway. Renner stood in the middle of the consultation room with his phone in his hand and the window behind him showing the dark Oregon evening and the lights of Harlan Falls spreading out in the distance. And he had the look of a man who had spent a long time in rooms deciding outcomes and was now in a room where the outcome had been decided without him. You should sit down, Nora said. He didn't sit, but he also didn't move. Vorn arrived at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Nora counted. The agent came through the stairwell door at the end of the corridor with her badge out and her other hand at her hip and moved down the hallway with the focused economy of someone who had been running and was not showing all of it. She took in the doorway, Nora, the room, Renner, in approximately 1 second. Paul Renner, she said. Federal agent, do not move. He did not move. Vorn looked at Nora. Are you hurt? No. The physician? At the nurse's station. She's shaken, not hurt. Vorn exhaled once, sharp. Then she stepped past Nora into the room, and that part of it was no longer Nora's problem to manage. The hallway outside room 316 became busy very quickly after that. 2 hospital security guards arrived within 4 minutes, followed by a Harlan Falls PD officer who had been responding to a welfare call and had not expected to walk into a federal situation and handled the recalibration with reasonable composure. Vorn's backup, another federal agent named Delacroix who had been managing the west loading corridor, arrived 6 minutes after that, slightly out of breath, and took over the logistics of holding Renner in the room while Vorn coordinated with Selin's office by phone. Nora stood in the hallway and watched all of it happen and felt the specific physical sensation of aftermath, the particular flatness that followed a sustained period of high alertness, like the air pressure changing after a front moved through. Her hands were completely steady, which was the thing that always surprised her and always shouldn't have, because she had been in enough of these moments to know that the shaking, when it came later, in the quiet. Sona Maris was sitting in a chair at the nurse's station with a cup of water she wasn't drinking and one of the floor nurses beside her. She looked up when Nora came over. Are you a federal agent? She asked. No. Nora pulled a chair over and sat down at the same level. I'm a nurse. I used to work at Callaway. Something moved through Maris's expression. Callaway. That's the patient, the one last week, the accident on Route 7. Yes. Maris looked at her for a moment. He was part of this. Yes. And the man in my office, he came to me tonight and said the delivery needed to be authorized before the scheduled window. He said there were regulatory issues and that it needed to go through me directly. She stopped. He knew my schedule. He knew my authorization codes. He knew that I had signed off on equipment deliveries for this supplier 3 times before. Because you had. Because I had. The supplier is legitimate. Or it looked legitimate. The first 3 deliveries were ordinary equipment. I had no reason. She stopped again. You had no reason to question it, Nora said. That's how it works. They establish the pattern first. Maris turned the water cup slowly. I told him I needed to verify with administration. That's when he... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He made sure you stayed in that room. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment. Down the corridor, Vorn was still on the phone, and the sound of her conversation, controlled, rapid, authoritative, filled the hallway in patches. I'm going to need to give a statement, Maris said. Not as a question. Yes. Tonight, probably. Okay. She set down the water cup. She had the quality of someone who was still frightened but was actively putting the fright somewhere manageable because that was what she was trained to do. Okay. Selins arrived at Harlan Falls Regional at 8:22 p.m. She came through the main entrance with Tamblin behind her and 2 additional agents Nora hadn't seen before, and she went directly to Vorn's position before she went anywhere else, which was the right order, and Nora noted it. Then she came to the hallway where Nora was sitting on a bench outside the consultation suite and stood in front of her for a moment without saying anything, which was also its own kind of communication. Holt is in custody, Selin said. The airfield operation concluded at 7:50. The charter aircraft had a second passenger, an individual who connects to Renner's organizational structure in a way we've been trying to establish for 4 months. So you got 2? We got 2. A pause. And the delivery vehicle arrived at the East Dock at 7:38. Our agents were there. The manifest discrepancy was documented on site. The containers are in federal custody, and the receiving record, which was never signed because Maris was never able to sign it, is intact. So the chain holds. The chain holds. Sellens looked at her. Because Maris didn't sign it. Because you kept Renner in that room long enough for Vorn to get there. She paused. And because you left your apartment when I told you to stay. Nora looked at the floor. I'm not going to tell you that was the right call, Sellens said. Operationally, as a matter of protocol, it wasn't. I know. But, Sellens stopped. The outcome is what it is. Is that as close as you get to saying thank you? Tonight it is. But something in her face moved in a direction that wasn't entirely professional. Yes. Tamblyn appeared at the end of the hallway and gestured to Sellens. She looked at Nora. Statement tonight when you're ready. There's no rush in the next hour. I'm ready now. Give me 20 minutes. She went. Nora stayed on the bench. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. Tamblyn's phone is back. Apparently, I'm not allowed unsupervised communication. She looked at the message for a moment. How's your head? Hurts. Worth it. A pause. Vorn checked in. You're okay. I'm okay. Good. Another pause. Go give your statement. Sleep after. Medical advice from a man with a subdural. Resolving subdural. And then, I mean it. Sleep. She put the phone away and sat there until Tamblyn came to get her, and then she went and gave the statement. And it took an hour and 15 minutes, and at the end of it, Tamblyn looked at his notes for a long moment, and then looked at her and said, For the record, you identified the mechanism of injury from field assessment alone in a setting where every institutional pressure was pointing you away from doing that. Yes. And you came to regional tonight without backup or authorization. Yes. I'm not going to tell you that was tactically sound. I know. But the evidence chain is intact, and Maris is unharmed, and Renner is in custody. He looked at his notes again. So, she agreed. The next 72 hours moved in the specific way that legal and federal processes move, when the evidentiary position is strong and the people managing it are under pressure to demonstrate accountability. Fast in some places, agonizingly slow in others, and rarely at the speed that the people at the center of it preferred. The Oregon State Nursing Board received Garrett Lund's emergency reinstatement filing the morning after the regional incident. The federal documentation attached to it, Sellens' office, had moved with uncommon efficiency, laid out the sequence of events at Callaway in terms that the board could not address slowly without creating a secondary accountability problem for themselves. The suspension review was scheduled for 48 hours after filing, which was, by the board's own admission to Lund, the fastest they had moved on any matter in the current director's tenure. Nora spent those 48 hours in her apartment, not because she was told to stay there, but because there was nowhere else she needed to be, and the cumulative debt of the previous days was collecting interest. She slept in long, dense blocks that did not feel recuperative at first, and then gradually did. She ate actual meals at the table instead of standing over the counter. She called Carla and told her the fuller version, and Carla listened without interrupting, which cost her something. And when Nora finished, her sister said, I need you to promise me that from now on, when you decide to walk into a room with a potentially armed man alone, you at least text me first. And the thing in Nora's chest that had been held at a particular tension for several days released enough for her to actually laugh. Gerald Marsh's cooperation with federal investigators produced, in those same 48 hours, 47 pages of documented evidence. His 9 months of parallel records, cross-referenced against the email file sent to Nora's laptop, which had been traced to a burner account that Gerald confirmed he had not created. Someone else had also been watching Holt. That thread was still being pulled. Marcus Holt was formally charged on the second day. The charges included conspiracy to obstruct justice, intentional endangerment of a patient, and material support of an illegal trafficking operation. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that neither his attorney nor anyone else in the room appeared to find fully convincing. The arraignment was not public, but the charging document was, and by the afternoon it had reached the regional news cycle, and by evening it was on every platform that carried Pacific Northwest medical news, which turned out to be more of them than Nora had expected. She did not watch the coverage. She read the charging document when Lund sent it to her. She read it carefully, the way she read everything. And when she got to the section that described the administrative hold placed on patient Wade Corrick at Callaway Medical Center and the coordinated effort to restrict treatment with intent to cause patient death, she sat with it for a moment and thought about the 15 minutes between 11:59 p.m. and the first escalation, when she had stood at the bedside of a man she didn't know and watched the numbers and calculated the time. She had been right about all of it. She did not feel satisfied about being right. She felt something more complicated, something that included the awareness that she had been one decision, one moment of obedience, one moment of choosing the safe thing, away from being wrong in a way that could not be corrected. Phyllis Drummond cooperated with investigators without an attorney present, which her attorney subsequently described as a significant error. What Drummond told investigators was that she had been receiving pressure from Renner's organizational contact, not Renner directly, but a person above him, whose identity she did not know, for 4 months, and that the pressure had taken the form of communications she had interpreted as administrative directives from a regulatory body that turned out not to exist. She had been, in the language investigators used in their preliminary report, an unwitting conduit. Whether the courts would agree with that framing remained to be established. Renner said nothing to anyone except his attorney, which was the tactically correct decision, and also the one that told investigators the most about what he knew and what he was protecting. The gray suit, it turned out, connected to a network that extended well beyond Marcus Holt and Callaway Medical Center. Corrick's 13 months of investigation had established the shape of it. Medical supply chains as transport infrastructure, shell companies as the financial layer, sympathetic or compromised medical administrators as the authorization points. What the evidence from Callaway and Harlan Falls Regional added was the specific operational mechanism, the way a routine delivery could carry something that was not on the manifest, authorized by a person who believed they were signing for ordinary equipment, processed through a receiving system that had no reason to look deeper. It was, Tamblyn told Nora during a follow-up meeting 3 days after the regional incident, genuinely clever. He said it the way investigators say things like that, without admiration, just acknowledgement of the fact that something well-designed is well-designed, regardless of what it's designed to do. 7 hospitals, Tamblyn said, over 18 months. We're still building the full inventory of what moved through them. Were any of them targeted because of patient vulnerability? The patients? No, the patients were incidental. The hospitals were chosen for their supply chain volume and their administrative structure. Facilities that processed high volumes of equipment had less scrutiny per item. He paused. Callaway was chosen because of its location on the Route 7 corridor and its manageable administration. It wasn't about the patients. That should have been more reassuring than it was. Nora filed it away. The nursing board hearing was not what she expected. She had expected something formal, procedural, the institutional equivalent of a meeting that had already decided its outcome and was performing the process of deciding it. What she got was something closer to that, but with a quality of discomfort about it that she had not anticipated. The specific discomfort of people who had made an institutional error and were in the process of acknowledging it, without being able to fully acknowledge it, because full acknowledgement would require a degree of accountability that the institution had not prepared itself for. The board chair, a woman named Dr. Yvette Osei, who had been in the position for 6 years and had the posture of someone who had seen most things, read the reinstatement order and the federal documentation and the counterfiling from Callaway's own legal team, which had pivoted overnight from defending the suspension to distancing itself from the people who had imposed it, and then looked at Nora directly. Ms. Callihan, she said, the board finds that the suspension of your nursing license was procedurally improper and was imposed under circumstances that do not reflect legitimate regulatory grounds. The suspension is lifted effective immediately and will be expunged from your licensure record. Nora said, "Thank you." "I want to be clear," Osei continued, and there was something in her voice that was not quite an apology, but was the institutional structure that had been built around the place where an apology would have been, that the process by which the suspension was submitted to this board was irregular. The board acted on information provided by Callaway administration that was, as federal investigation has established, materially misleading. That is a failure of our verification process, and it's one we're addressing. "I understand," Nora said. She did understand. She also understood that addressing was a process with a timeline and an outcome that would bear only oblique relation to what had happened to her specifically, and that this was the nature of institutional accountability, and she was not going to get more from this room than what it was capable of giving. Lund, beside her, was making a note. The hearing lasted 22 minutes. When it was over, they walked out into the gray Oregon afternoon. It had stopped raining finally, for the first time in what felt like weeks, and Lund said, "The wrongful termination case against Callaway is substantially stronger now. The board's acknowledgement of procedural irregularity on their end directly supports the claim that—" "I know," Nora said. "Walk me through it tonight. I need some air right now." He stopped. "Of course." She walked to the parking lot and stood beside her car and looked at the sky, which was the particular pale gray of Pacific Northwest winter clouds that have finally exhausted their water content and are just sitting there, spent and thin, with actual light coming through the edges. She did not feel triumphant. She had not expected to. What she felt was something quieter and less legible than triumph. The particular sensation of having been right about a thing that mattered, and having paid for being right, and coming out the other side of the payment into a landscape that was recognizably the same and also not quite. Her phone rang. Sellens. "The board?" Sellens asked. "Reinstated. Expunged." "Good. I have something to tell you." A pause, and within the pause was the quality of information that was either better or worse than expected, and Nora waited to find out which. Renner talked. When? An hour ago. His attorney worked out a preliminary cooperation agreement, and he gave us the name above him in the organizational structure, the person who was directing the hospital network. Another pause. His name is Dennis Farrow. He's a former executive of a federal defense procurement office who has been running private sector operations for the last 4 years through a series of holding companies. Corrick had him on a watch list but hadn't been able to establish the direct connection to the supply chain operation. Renner gave you enough to make that connection? Renner gave us enough to make most of it. The rest, the financial instruments, the holding company structure, that's going to take time. But Farrow knows we have Renner's cooperation, and he knows that Holt's records are in our possession, and he knows the containers at Regional are in federal custody. Sellen's voice was precise. Which means he's going to move. He's going to run. Or he's going to try to close the gaps before he does. There are 2 individuals connected to his network who have material knowledge of the financial instruments, specifically the shell company that held the distribution contracts. Those individuals are currently not in federal custody, and their locations are— Sellen stopped. Their locations are being established. Nora stood by her car in the pale afternoon. You're telling me it's not finished? I'm telling you the structural case is strong and Farrow is exposed, and the people below him have either cooperated or are in custody. I'm also telling you that Farrow himself is not yet in custody, and that he has resources, and that a man with resources and the knowledge that the walls are closing has options. Does Corrick know? We briefed him this morning. A pause. He took it about the way you'd expect. Which means he wanted to leave the hospital. Which means we had a conversation about why he was going to stay in the hospital. Something in Sellen's voice that might, in a different context, have been dry. He's staying. Okay. Nora, I need you to be aware of this, not because your protection status is changing, it's not, and the detail on your building stays in place, but because Farrow knows your name. Renner confirmed that. He knows what you did at Callaway and at Regional, and he knows that you're a cooperating witness. He's known that. He knows it more specifically now. Sellens paused. I want you to understand the shape of what we're dealing with. I understand it. After the call, she got in her car and sat there for a moment. Dennis Farrow. A name she hadn't had 2 hours ago. A former defense official who had built an infrastructure that moved weapons components through hospital supply chains, and who now knew that the person who had inadvertently started the collapse of that infrastructure was a nurse from Callaway Medical Center who drove a 12-year-old Subaru and lived on the 3rd floor of a building in East Harlan Falls. She started the car. On the way home, she passed Callaway Medical Center. She didn't mean to. It was not on her direct route, but she turned wrong twice without noticing and found herself on the street that ran along the hospital's west face, the one with the ambulance bay and the loading entrance and the small staff parking area where she had parked for 23 months. She did not stop. She drove past. But she looked. The ambulance bay was active, so 2 units parked, the back doors of one still open, staff moving with the particular purposeful urgency of people whose job has not changed because the institution around them is in upheaval. The work continued. It always continued. That was the thing about hospitals. They were bigger than any single person's decision to corrupt them, which was also the thing that made the corruption possible and the thing that made it recoverable. She drove home. The protective detail was there, the sedan, the second vehicle. One of the agents was standing near the building entrance with a coffee cup, and he nodded when she walked past, which was more acknowledgement than agents typically gave, and which she took to mean that news traveled inside the detail, and the news from the nursing board hearing had reached him. She went upstairs. She made dinner. An actual dinner, not something assembled from whatever was at the front of the refrigerator. She cooked, and the act of cooking, which required attention and sequence and small decisions without stakes, was more restorative than she would have been able to explain. She was washing the dishes when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. Unknown number, different from the one she'd seen before, with an area code she didn't recognize. She looked at it. You should have signed the document. She stood at the sink with her hands still wet and read the message twice. Then she looked at the timestamp. 2 minutes ago. She picked up her phone and called Sellens. Unknown number, she said when Sellens answered. Just texted me. You need to see it. She forwarded the message. Sellens was quiet for a moment after it went through. Stay inside, she said. Already there. That number is... A pause with background movement in it. Someone else in Sellens' space doing something at speed. It's a burner. Pacific Northwest area code, but those are easy to spoof. It could be anywhere. It's Pharaoh. A longer pause. Possibly, Sellens said. It's Pharaoh, Nora said again. Renner cooperated an hour ago. Pharaoh knows. And he's telling me he knows I'm the reason the document didn't get signed and the chain didn't get broken, and Renner had enough to give you. She looked at the message on her screen. He's not threatening me. He's telling me he knows exactly where this started. Sellens said nothing for a moment. I know, she said finally. I know. What does that mean for tonight? It means we move faster, Sellens said. And it means, Nora, the detail on your building is going to increase in the next hour. Please don't leave the apartment. I won't. The call ended. Nora put her phone on the counter and looked at the message one more time and then set the phone face down because there was nothing more to learn from looking at it. You should have signed the document. He wasn't wrong that the document had mattered. He wasn't wrong about where it had started. One nurse, one night shift, one decision not to sign a piece of paper that would have bought her job back and cost her everything else. But here was the thing about Dennis Pharaoh that he did not yet understand about her. She had been in rooms like that consultation suite before. She had been in worse rooms, in worse conditions, with worse odds and less backup. She had been the person standing between a situation and its outcome more times than she could account for. And the lesson every one of those times had eventually taught her, the one that had taken the longest to learn and the one she was most certain of, was that the moment you started making decisions based on what you were afraid of losing was the moment you started losing things worth keeping. She had not signed the document. She was not going to. And Dennis Pharaoh, wherever he was with his burner phone and his deteriorating network, was going to learn that the thing he was most worried about, the one thread that had started unraveling everything, was not going to stop pulling just because he'd sent a text message at 11:30 at night. Her phone buzzed again. Same number. I know where Korik is. She looked at the message, 4 words, and in them was the full shape of what Pharaoh had decided to do. Not threaten her, not run, not wait for the legal structure to close around him. He was telling her that he still had a move, that the man upstairs in the neurology unit with the federal protection detail and the resolving subdural and the 13-month investigation that had brought all of this to this specific point was a piece on a board that Pharaoh still believed he was playing. She called Sellens before she had fully processed what she was going to say. Sellens answered on the first ring. Second message, Nora said. Same number. He says he knows where Korik is. The silence on Sellens' end lasted exactly 2 seconds, which was the shortest silence that particular information could produce in a person who understood what it meant. Then Sellens said 3 words in a voice that had gone completely flat. We're moving now. Then Sellens said 3 words in a voice that had gone completely flat. We're moving now. The next 4 minutes were the kind that didn't have a shape until they were over. Nora stood in her kitchen with the phone still warm in her hand and listened to Selin's end of the call fracture into overlapping voices. Radio traffic, someone calling a unit number, a door, footsteps on what sounded like a hard floor moving fast. Selin's had not hung up. She had just stopped talking to Nora and started talking to everyone else, which meant Nora was standing in her kitchen at 11:40 at night with an open line to a federal operation in progress and absolutely nothing to do with her hands. She put the phone on the counter on speaker and went to the window, and this time she did not step back from it because the threat was not outside her building. It was across town in a hospital room on the third floor of a neurology unit, where a man with a resolving subdural hematoma and a monitored phone and 2 federal agents outside his door was about to become the focal point of whatever move Dennis Farrow had decided was his last viable option. She could hear Selin's voice in fragments, unit positions, floor plans, something about a service entrance. She heard Tamblin's voice once, clear and brief, giving a floor number. Then she heard something she was not supposed to hear. A different voice, not one she recognized, coming through what sounded like a radio feed on Selin's end. "Third floor is clear. Patient is secure. Repeat, patient is secure." She exhaled. Her shoulders came down approximately 2 inches. Selin's came back on the line 30 seconds later. "He's fine," she said. "We had eyes on his room. Whatever Farrow intended, or whatever he wanted you to believe he intended, it didn't materialize. The hospital is being swept now." "What did he intend?" "We don't know yet." A pause. "The text may have been a pressure move, testing whether we'd pull resources from one location to cover another. To cover Korik." "Yes, which would leave something else exposed." A breath. "It may also have been exactly what it said, a threat against Korik that we disrupted by moving fast enough. We're still working out which." "And Farrow?" A longer pause this time. "We have a location," Selin said. 40 minutes ago we didn't. Renner's Cooperation gave us a property connected to one of the shell companies, a commercial space in the industrial district south of Harlan Falls. We have units moving there now." Her voice was careful. "I'm not going to tell you more than that. Because you don't know more than that. Because I don't know more than that yet." A beat. "Go to sleep, Nora. You keep telling me that. You keep not doing it." The call ended. She did not go to sleep. She sat on the couch and watched the clock move from 11:47 to 12:09 to 12:31. And somewhere around 12:45, the phone buzzed with a single text from Selin's. "Property confirmed. Active situation. Will update." She put the phone on the cushion beside her and closed her eyes, not sleeping, just giving the back of her eyelids something to focus on that wasn't a clock. When the phone buzzed again at 1:17 a.m., she was awake before the second vibration. "Farrow is in custody. Update in the morning." She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone down and sat in the quiet apartment and listened to the rain, which had come back in the night while she wasn't paying attention, soft and steady on the glass. And she let herself feel the particular relief of a situation that has been resolved. Not completely, not cleanly, because nothing was ever complete or clean, but resolved enough that the specific pressure that had been sitting behind her sternum for the last 4 days could begin, slowly, to ease. She went to bed at 1:23 a.m. and slept without dreaming until 7:41. Selin's came at 9. She looked like she had not slept, which was accurate, and she accepted coffee with the gratitude of someone for whom caffeine had shifted from preference to medical necessity somewhere around 3 in the morning. She sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Nora noticed, same position, like the table had assigned them both their spots on the first visit and neither of them had questioned it. "Farrow was at the property," Selin said. "He was alone. He had communication equipment, financial documents, and a prepaid phone that matches the number that texted you last night." She turned her coffee cup. "He did not come quietly, which is neither surprising nor relevant to anything at this point. He's in federal custody. He'll be arraigned today." "What were his charges?" "The initial list is long. Conspiracy, racketeering, illegal trafficking of controlled materials, obstruction of a federal investigation, witness intimidation. The texts to you last night are covered under that. An accessory to assault in the matter of the Route 7 incident involving Korik." Selin's paused. "There will be more as the financial investigation develops." "How long will that take?" "The financial piece? Months. Possibly longer. The shell company structure is layered, and some of it runs through offshore instruments that require international cooperation to trace. She took a drink of coffee. But the core criminal case, the trafficking operation, the hospital network, the conspiracy, that's solid. The evidence from Callaway and Regional combined with Renner's cooperation and Corrick's investigation record gives us a case that doesn't require the financial piece to prosecute. Nora thought about this. Renner's deal, what does it look like? Reduce charges in exchange for full cooperation. He'll serve time. Less than Farrow, significantly less than Holt, but time. Sellens looked at her. That's the nature of cooperation agreements. It's not satisfying, it's functional. I know how it works. I know you do. A pause. Holt's attorney tried to enter a cooperation agreement this morning. We declined it. Something in Nora's chest settled. Why? Because we don't need it. We have Gerald Marsh's 9 months of documentation, the federal email file, the administrative records from Callaway, Corrick's full investigation, and your testimony. Sellens set down her cup. Holt has nothing to trade that we don't already have, so he faces the full charges without the benefit of a deal. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain, lighter this morning than last night, almost tentative. What happens to Callaway? Nora asked. The hospital itself, the institution, isn't being charged. The individuals are. But the board has already initiated an internal review, and the state health authority is conducting a parallel investigation into the administrative structures that allowed Holt's interference to go unreported for 16 months. Sellens' voice was neutral, factual. There will be consequences for the institution. They'll take a different form than the individual charges, but they'll be real. And Drummond? Unwitting conduit is holding as a characterization, at least for now. She cooperated fully, and the evidence supports her account that she didn't know the full scope of what she was facilitating. A pause. She resigned from Callaway 2 days ago. Nora nodded slowly. There's one more thing, Sellens said. Corrick's investigation, the formal record, the 13 months of work he did on the trafficking network, is going to a federal task force that will use it to pursue the broader operation. The 7 hospitals, the distribution network, the individuals who haven't been identified yet. She looked at Nora directly. Your testimony, your clinical assessment of Corrick's injuries, your identification of the mechanism, that material is part of the evidentiary package that gets submitted with his investigation record. I know. I want you to understand what that means. It means your name is attached to something that is going to prosecute people beyond just Holt and Farrow and Renner. It means the work you did that night, the work that cost you your job, is part of a formal federal record that will outlast this case. Nora looked at the table. I wasn't looking for that, she said. I know. And Sellens' voice, for a moment, lost. Some of its professional compression and became something that sounded more like what it actually was. One person talking to another person about something that mattered. That's why it means what it means. She saw Wade Corrick for the first time in person, consciously, with him actually awake and present, 8 days after the night at Callaway. I was being discharged. The subdural had resolved on schedule, the rib fractures were healing, the rhabdomyolysis had been managed without lasting renal impact, which was the piece that had required the most sustained intervention and the most careful monitoring, and which the neurology team had handled well. His left shoulder had been reduced and was immobilized in a brace. He moved carefully, the way people move when they are managing pain they have decided not to lead with. Sellens had arranged it, the meeting, the timing, the relative privacy of a family consultation room on the discharge floor, empty except for the 2 of them, and a federal agent posted outside the door who was doing his job without making it visible. Corrick was sitting when she came in. He stood when she entered, which she immediately gestured him back down from, because standing on a healing rib fracture to observe a social convention was not something she was going to allow in her presence. Sit down, she said. He sat. You sound like a nurse. I am a nurse. She took the chair across from him, reinstated as of last week. I heard. He looked at her for a moment. He had a direct quality in person that the text had suggested but not fully conveyed, the particular directness of someone who had spent a long time in environments where indirect communication cost lives and had built the habit of looking at things straight on. He was not conventionally imposing. He was the kind of person you would not immediately identify as dangerous, which she understood was probably useful to him professionally. "How are you doing with all of it? Ask me again in a month." "Fair." He turned his coffee cup, an involuntary gesture, she had noticed it in herself, seemed to be something people did at tables in difficult conversations. "I owe you a more substantial conversation than the one we were able to have through a monitored phone." "You don't owe me anything." "I disagree with that." "You can disagree with it and still not owe me anything. They're not mutually exclusive." He looked at her for a moment. "You're frustrating to try to do something nice for." "You already tried. You sent me an attorney. I sent you a resource you needed. That's different from Korik." She leaned forward slightly. "You were a stranger on a table in a hospital that was trying to let you die. I did my job. The fact that your job turned out to be something that mattered for reasons beyond that room it's not the reason I did it. It doesn't change the math of what happened." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "but it changes what I know about the person who did it." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Something settled between them that was not resolution exactly, more like acknowledgement. The recognition between two people who have been through adjacent versions of the same thing and understand each other's version without needing it explained. "How long before you're back in the field?" she asked. 6 weeks, if I follow medical direction. 8, realistically, because I'm terrible at following medical direction. I'm going to give you the same advice I give every patient who says that. Which is? The injury doesn't care about your timeline. He almost smiled. I'll remember that. You won't, but I'll say it anyway. She stood up. He didn't stand this time, caught himself, stayed seated, which she appreciated. At the door she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "the 13 months of work you did, what it's going to be used for, the task force investigation, the other hospitals, that matters. The patients in those hospitals matter." "I know," he said. "I know you know." She looked at him. "I just wanted to say it out loud." She left. In the hallway, she passed the federal agent posted at the door who did not acknowledge her, and she took the stairs down and walked out of the hospital into a February morning that had, finally, relented enough to let some actual sunlight through the cloud layer, pale and watery, but present, falling on the wet pavement of the parking lot in a way that made the surface look briefly like something worth looking at. The formal hearing before the Callaway Medical Center Board of Directors took place 3 weeks later. It was not a criminal proceeding. Those were moving through federal and state courts on their own timelines. But it was the institutional proceeding that Nora had been told, by Garrett Lund, carried the most immediate practical consequence for her professional standing and for the record that would follow her through her career. She had not asked for a public hearing. The board had scheduled one anyway, which Lund explained was the result of pressure from the state health authority, from the federal investigation's findings, and from a coalition of Callaway nursing staff who had filed a formal grievance with the board in the 2 weeks following Holt's arrest. The grievance had 41 signatures on it. Gerald Marsh's name was at the top. The hearing room was a conference space on the 5th floor of a building adjacent to Callaway. Neutral ground, technically, though it had the feel of all institutional spaces. The specific blankness of rooms designed to hold difficult conversations without absorbing them. There were board members on one side of a long table and Nora and Lund on the other, and the public seating section at the back of the room held approximately 30 people, which was more than Nora had expected and which she did not look at directly when she came in. The board chair was not the person who had initially overseen her termination. That person had quietly stepped back from the role in the preceding weeks. The acting chair was a man named Bernard Okafor, a physician who had joined the board the previous year and had the quality of someone who was determined to handle what he'd inherited without pretending it was something other than what it was. "Ms. Callihan," he said, "the purpose of this hearing is to formally address the circumstances of your termination from Callaway Medical Center and to enter into the hospital's official record the board's findings and determination." He read into the record the sequence of events: the patient's arrival, the administrative hold, Nora's clinical decisions, the suspension and termination, and the subsequent federal investigation findings regarding Marcus Holt's role in the events of that night. He read it carefully, without editorializing, but the act of reading it carefully and without editorializing was itself a form of editorializing, because every item in the sequence made the same point, and the accumulation was impossible to hear as anything other than what it was. When he finished, he looked at her. The board finds that your termination was wrongful, retaliatory, and not grounded in legitimate clinical or institutional cause. The termination is formally reversed and will be expunged from your employment record." He paused. "The board further finds that your clinical decisions on the night in question were consistent with the standard of care and with the ethical obligations of your profession, and that the pressure applied to you by hospital administration to deviate from that standard of care was itself a serious institutional failure for which this board accepts responsibility." The room was very quiet. Lund, beside her, was writing something. "The hospital will be issuing a formal apology," Okafor continued, "and the board has voted to authorize a settlement in the matter of your wrongful termination. You'll receive formal documentation through your legal counsel." He looked at her steadily. "Is there anything you'd like to say for the record, Ms. Callihan?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it during the drive over, and before that in the apartment, and before that in the days that had accumulated since Pharaoh's arrest. She had thought about what she would want to have on record, and what it actually meant to have things on record, and whether what she wanted to say was for the board or for herself or for the 30 people sitting behind her, some of whom she recognized from the overnight shift, and some of whom she didn't. "Yes," she said. She looked at the table for a moment, then at Okafor. "The night I treated Wade Corrick, I made a decision that I knew was going to cost me something. I didn't know how much, but I knew there was a cost, and I made the decision anyway. And I want to be clear that the reason I made it had nothing to do with being brave or principled or any of the other things that get said about situations like this in retrospect." She paused. "I made it because I was looking at a man who was going to die if I didn't, and I knew how to stop that from happening. And I was not willing to be the person who stood in that room and let it happen because someone with a higher title than me told me it was policy." She stopped. "I was a combat medic for 6 years before I was a nurse. In that time, the one thing I learned, the one thing that actually stayed, was that the moment you start making the preservation of your position more important than the thing your position is supposed to be for, you've lost the only thing that made the position worth preserving." She looked at the board members. "I don't say that as a criticism of anyone who made a different choice that night. People have things they need to protect. I understand that. But I also think the people in this institution who stayed quiet, who watched and didn't speak, need to sit with what that cost. Not as punishment, as information." She was done. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out anyway. Okafor looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. And then, quieter, with something in it that was not board chair language. "Thank you." Afterward, in the corridor outside the hearing room, Gerald Marsh found her. He was in his civilian clothes. He was not working days, had taken leave during the federal process. And he looked like himself outside the hospital context, which was to say, he looked slightly less certain of where to put his hands. He was carrying a paper coffee cup, and he offered it to her without speaking, which was so consistent with every interaction she'd had with him that she almost laughed. She took the coffee. 41 signatures, she said, 43 by the time we submitted it. 2 people added theirs after it went in. He turned his own cup. Farrell signed. She was the first one. Of course she had been. "How long?" Nora asked. "How long were you keeping those records?" 9 months and 4 days. He said it without hesitation, which meant he had counted. "I started after the second incident. There was a patient, before you came to Callaway, where Holt made a call I couldn't document at the time. I told myself I'd watch more carefully after that." He paused. "I watched for 9 months, and I didn't do anything with it, because a record without a witness is just a grievance. And then I walked in. And then you walked in." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry that it cost you what it cost you." "Gerald, I mean it. I could have... You gave 9 months of your professional life to documenting something that everyone around you was pretending not to see," she said. "You didn't owe me a warning about what I was walking into. You didn't even know what I was walking into when I walked into it." She looked at him. "What you did was enough. It was more than enough." He nodded once. He did not look entirely convinced, which was the appropriate response for a careful person who had spent 9 months with something on his conscience, but he accepted it, which was what mattered. They stood in the corridor for a moment, 2 people who had been on the same floor of the same hospital for nearly 2 years, without fully knowing what they were each carrying, drinking coffee, in the February morning light that came through the end window in a long pale stripe across the linoleum. Are you coming back? He asked. To Callaway? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not as a formality. I don't know yet, she said. Lund says I have options. The settlement gives me time to figure out what I actually want to do with them. What are you thinking? Harlan Falls Regional reached out, the neurology department specifically. She paused. Dr. Maris. Gerald raised an eyebrow. That's different work than ER. It is. Would you like it? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. She turned the coffee cup. I think I've been in overnight emergency medicine for 2 years, partly because the pace of it kept me from having to figure out what I actually want from the work. And I think that was useful for a while, and then it stopped being useful. He nodded. He understood that, she could tell. The thing where you stay in a version of yourself because the version is functional and the alternatives require more stillness than you currently have. Let me know, he said, when you figure it out. You'll be the first call. He went back down the corridor toward the elevator, coffee cup in hand, and she watched him go and thought about 9 months of paper records kept off-site, and a man who had decided that watching was not sufficient, and then waited, with a patience she found almost incomprehensible, for the moment when watching could become something else. Marcus Holt's trial began 7 weeks later. Nora did not follow it in real time. She read the summaries that Lund sent her, the charging decisions, the key motions, the testimony schedule, and she gave her own testimony on the 4th day of the proceedings in a federal courthouse 40 miles from Harlan Falls, in a room with high windows and bad acoustics that swallowed voices at the edges. She testified for 3 hours. The defense attempted twice to characterize her clinical decisions as reckless overreach, and she answered both attempts the same way, by describing, in precise medical language, the specific indicators she had observed and the specific evidence-based conclusions those indicators supported, and by making clear that the only thing that had been reckless in Trauma 2 that night was the decision to let a man die because his death served someone's interests. The defense did not ask a third question on that topic. Paul Renner was sentenced before Holt's trial concluded. Cooperation agreements moved faster through the system. He received 4 years, which was less than what the charges could have carried, and more than nothing, which was the arithmetic of deals. He did not appear to have feelings about it publicly, or if he did, he had sufficient experience with the relevant context not to express them where anyone could record them. Dennis Farrow's trial was scheduled for 8 months out. The financial investigation had expanded the charges significantly. Additional counts, additional jurisdictions, additional individuals identified through the shell company structure. Corrick's task force was still working. It would be working for a while. Holt was convicted on all counts after 11 days of testimony. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, which was not long, and returned with a verdict that was read by the foreperson in a flat sequential voice that gave each charge the same weight, which meant that by the time she got to the 5th count, intentional endangerment of a patient, the weight had accumulated enough that the courtroom was very quiet. Nora was not in the room for the verdict. She was in Harlan Falls, working the afternoon shift in the neurology consultation suite at Regional, which was a quieter rhythm than emergency medicine and required a different kind of attention, more sustained, less acute, and which she was slowly learning to find sufficient. She heard about the verdict from Lund by text at 4:17 p.m. between patients. She read the text twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to her next appointment, which was a follow-up with an elderly man who had a peripheral neuropathy that was progressing more slowly than his previous physician had predicted, and who wanted to know what that meant. And she sat down with him and told him what it meant in terms he could use, and he listened with the attentiveness of someone who has learned that information is better than the alternative. And when they were finished, he shook her hand and said, "You're a good nurse," with the simple directness of someone who had decided to say the true thing rather than the formal thing. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it, the way you mean things when you have been reminded of why they matter. Oh. She had dinner with Carla that weekend. Her sister had driven up from Sacramento, which was a 6-hour drive and not something Carla did without a specific reason. The reason was not stated explicitly, but was present in the way Carla looked at her across the restaurant table, with the assessing attention of someone who had been worried and was now in the process of verifying that the worry was no longer necessary. "You look better," Carla said. "I feel better." "The new job?" "Partly." Nora turned her water glass. partly just the other stuff being resolved. Not completely, but enough. Pharaoh's trial is still pending. I know. I'll testify there too, but that's not... She stopped, looking for the right word. That's not the center of it anymore. It was for a while, and now it isn't. Carla studied her. What is the center of it now? Nora thought about this for a moment, about the elderly man with the peripheral neuropathy and the handshake and the true thing instead of the formal thing, about the neurology suite and its different rhythm and the fact that she had spent 2 years in overnight emergency medicine running fast enough that she hadn't had to look directly at the thing she was running toward. About a man on a table in Trauma 2 and the 40 seconds that had changed the direction of everything, not dramatically, not cleanly, but irreversibly. The work, she said, just the work. Carla was quiet for a moment, turning her own glass. Then, you were always going to do it, you know, that night. I know you. You were always going to do exactly what you did. Maybe. Not maybe. You have a... Carla stopped, searched. You have a thing, where the right action is the right action, and you don't actually spend as much time as you pretend to spend wondering if you're going to do it. I spent real time wondering. You spent real time hoping the situation would change so you wouldn't have to. That's different. Carla picked up her water glass. You were never going to walk out of that room without trying. Nora thought about the moment in Trauma 2 when she had stepped back from the bed and written the time on the chart and waited, which was the only option she'd had, and about the specific quality of that waiting. The way it had felt like doing nothing and had actually been doing the calculation, running the numbers, arriving at the same answer she always arrived at when the numbers were about whether someone lived or died, and she had the training to affect the outcome. No, she said. I wasn't. Well, 3 months after the night at Callaway, the Oregon State Nursing Board issued a formal policy recommendation, the first of its kind in the state's regulatory history, requiring that all hospital administrative holds affecting patient treatment be subject to an independent clinical review within 2 hours of issuance, and that any nurse who acted in contravention of an administrative hold on clinical grounds be provided automatic regulatory protection pending a formal review of the hold itself. The policy was called, in the formal documentation, the Callaway Emergency Standards Review. Nobody called it that in practice. In practice, in the hospitals, in the nursing stations, in the break rooms where people talked about the things that actually mattered, it was referred to by the name of the nurse who had made it necessary. Not formally, not on any document, just in the way that institutional memory works, the way the specific story gets attached to the abstract principle and becomes the shorthand that people use when they want to explain why the principle exists. Nora did not know about this for several weeks. When she found out from Gerald, who had heard it from Justine, who had heard it from someone at the board. She was standing in the break room at Harlan Falls Regional with a coffee cup she'd been meaning to refill for 20 minutes. She stood there for a moment. Then she refilled her coffee and went back to work, because the break room was not where the work happened, and the work was where the point was. And that had not changed and was not going to change regardless of what anything was called or who remembered it or what was written on what document in what regulatory archive. She walked back down the corridor toward the consultation suite. She passed a young nurse going the other direction. New, she could tell. 3 weeks in, maybe, with the posture of someone who was learning that the job was larger than the training and was in the early stages of deciding whether that was frightening or interesting. The young nurse said, "Good morning," with the slightly effortful quality of someone who was working on the habit of it. "Good morning," Nora said back, and went to her patients. Because that was the thing about the work, the real thing, the thing that could not be suspended or expunged or revoked by anyone who hadn't done it. It was not about the recognition. It was not about the record or the policy or the name someone gave the thing that came after. It was about the moment in the room where the person on the table was still there, and you were still there. And everything between that moment and the outcome was the work you had trained for and the choice you kept making to do it right. Even when the room was arranged against you, even when the cost was real, even when the easier thing was right there within reach. And nobody would have blamed you for taking it. Nobody would have blamed Nora Callihan for signing that document, for taking the severance, accepting the separation, keeping her head down, and finding a different hospital in a different city and starting over without any of this. Nobody would have blamed her, but she would have known. And in rooms like Trauma 2, in moments like the one at 11:59 on a Thursday night with the monitors. Reading what they were reading and the orders saying what they were saying, and the man on the table spending down what he had left, what you knew about yourself was the only thing that was actually in your hands. She had always known that. She had just needed one night to prove it to everyone else.